A few years ago it became known about the creation of a single international trust between the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers. Many analysts were puzzled by this fact. After all, the entire 20th century was marked by the struggle of these two families. The official version is as follows: the two clans unite to survive in the waves of the global economic crisis. But what really happened? The first strangeness of the new alliance is that the superfamilies united the sums of only $40 billion. Such sums may seem decent to Bill Gates or Warren Buffett, but not to the world's leading financial clans. Today, the combined fortune of the Rothschilds, according to rough estimates, is off the scale of $4 trillion. The Rockefellers' total capital is calculated in the same order of magnitude, but $1 trillion less. It turns out that the union of capitals is not a bid for survival, but a clear claim to dominance in the post-crisis world, the tip of the iceberg in the struggle between some closed elites and others. But if the alliance of Rothschilds and Rockefellers is going to fight with someone, it means that they are not the first magnitudes in the world of global financial backstage. Mayer Rothschild, the founder of the dynasty, was born in Germany in 1744, and American John Rockefeller Sr. almost 100 years later. So, if these are relatively young families in historical perspective, then who was ruling the planet when the Rothschild Rockefellers were walking under the table? Maybe the family whose members founded their Standard Chartered Bank back in 1613. Real power is secret power and, as we know, big money likes silence, so the Baruchs always try to keep a low profile. Except when life demanded it, Bernard Baruch broke the rule by becoming an economic advisor to as many as 7 U.S. presidents. Here is his brief history. In 1881, the Baruch family moved to New York and young Bernard entered City College, graduating from which he worked as a broker at the New York Stock Exchange, and in 1903 established his own brokerage company. Contrary to the then fashion for associations and trust companies, Bernard Baruch conducts his rather successful brokerage business ostensibly alone, although, of course, the rise is provided by the support of the oldest clan. But for the public, Bernard gets the nickname Lone Wolf of Wall Street and by 33 years old becomes a millionaire, while managing to build up his capital in the face of ongoing crises in the United States. Since 1912, Baruch has been playing the political card, financing Woodrow Wilson's election campaign. In gratitude for his support, Wilson inducted him into the Office of National Defense. During World War I, Baruch becomes head of the U.S. Military-Industrial Committee and spins the flywheel of arms buildup, which allows for a while to overcome a series of crises in the economy of the country. It was Baruch, as an advisor to the president, induced Wilson to support the idea of creating the Fed, and since 1913 the U.S. government delegates the authority to produce dollar bills to a commercial structure, the Federal Reserve System. After the Russian Revolution, Baruch suddenly became an advocate of cooperation with the Soviet Union. Together with Hammer and Harriman, Lenin invites him to rebuild the national economy of the Soviet country. Some of the first factories built by Americans in Russia in 1920 to 1930 were tractor plants in Volgograd, Kharkov and Chelyabinsk. Of course, these plants had a dual purpose. In addition to tractors, they began to produce tanks, armored vehicles and other armaments. Automobiles necessary for the army were produced at two main plants, Gorky and Lykachayev, which was built in Chelyabinsk. Lykachev, which was built with subsidies from Henry Ford in the 1930s. American companies also built two huge steelworks, in Magnitogorsk and Kuznetsk. Anticipating the development of the situation in the world, Baruch and the American and British bankers in solidarity with him in the late 20s conduct a creative maneuver. He achieves the reorientation of the American economy to serve the military-industrial complex through its artificial collapse and plunge into crisis. He demonstrates his actions to a rather promising British politician Winston Churchill, whom he invites to America under the pretext of giving lectures. On October 24, 1929, the day of the New York Stock Exchange crash, Baruch brings Churchill to Wall Street. As the excited crowd raged outside the New York Stock Exchange, he shares with Churchill that a year before the crash he had stopped playing in the stock market, sold all his stocks and bought U.S. government bonds instead, ensuring that his capital would not depreciate. Churchill was impressed by this, and from then on their friendship with Baruch took on not only a personal character, but also features of a strategic partnership. It was Baruch and Churchill who became the active organizers of the game to strengthen and then collide Germany and the USSR. In the same 1933, the US fully established diplomatic relations with the USSR, and Bernard Baruch and prominent American politicians met in America's Soviet envoys, Maxim Litvinov and Eugene Rosenholz to develop a joint line of behavior. We should not forget that after the revolution Litvinov was the Bolshevik envoy in London and in December 1917 wrote a very curious letter of recommendation to the British diplomat and intelligence officer Lockhart about Trotsky. I consider his stay in Russia useful from the point of view of our interests. Speaking of Litvinov, 1939, in the minds of many of today's patriots who want immediate happiness to all and at once, Joseph Vissarionovich was quite full of power in the country. And here, what a tragedy, revealed direct betrayal of the then Commissar for Foreign Affairs, Litvinov, better known in certain circles as Mirganok Moisevich Valak. It is known what authoritative and competent authorities did with traitors to the motherland in those times. They punished them, sometimes quite severely and quickly. And what could the all-powerful Stalin do? Who, according to the memories of contemporaries, spoke at a government meeting on the betrayal of Litvinov Vala with difficulty keeping calm, and nothing serious. Ask Litvinov to write a statement at his own will, and put him under house arrest in a comfortable Litvinov's dacha. That's all. And the traitor died no less comfortably in 1951 at the venerable age of 75. It turns out that even Stalin could not dictate terms to these people. But let's return to Baruch, whose interests were not limited to the European theater. In 1934, in collaboration with U.S. Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau, he conducted an unprecedented operation to exchange China's gold reserve for a bundle of paper in the form of bonds. Cornered Chiang Kai-shek, suffering one defeat after another, agreed to this exchange, as a result of which the U.S. businessmen received at least 100 tons of gold in bullion and a huge amount of silver, jewelry and antiques, and Chiang Kai-shek, 250 sheets of paper and a quiet old age on the island of Taiwan. By the early 40s, Baruch was already a billionaire, but the peak of dividends from his politics-driven business came during World War II and the post-war nuclear arms race. The Japanese attack on the American naval base Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, may have been a surprise to some, but not to Baruch and the banking oligarchy. At the cost of this provocation, America was dragged into World War II, and the oligarchs, most notably Baruch, made a huge profit. During World War II, Baruch continued to advise the government and exerted the strongest influence over the distribution of government war orders. Billions of dollars went to fund the directions he suggested. In 1944, thanks to the skillful play of Baruch and his partners at Bretton Woods, war-torn Europe and the USSR agreed to recognize the US dollar as the world's reserve currency. After World War II, Baruch took over the US nuclear program and took over the atomic industry. Baruch wants to rule the world, the moon and perhaps Jupiter, but we'll see about that, President Truman wrote in his diary. This phrase clearly demonstrates who actually made significant decisions, and the president had only to envy, but could not openly oppose. With the beginning of the arms race, which brought fabulous profits to the contractors of the American military-industrial complex, Baruch personally supervised the production of the American atomic bomb under the motto, "We must go forward with the atomic bomb in one hand and the cross in the other." After the demonstration of U.S. might by the atomic bombing of the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6 and 9, 1945, the Soviet Union took all measures to restore nuclear parity. In this situation, the U.S. hurried, on the one hand, to convince the world community of its peace-loving aspirations, and on the other hand, conducted a cunning combination to subordinate America to the development of nuclear energy throughout the world. Of course, the initiator of such a large-scale plan was none other than Baruch, who was appointed by President Harry Truman as the U.S. representative to the UN Commission on Atomic Energy. At its first meeting on June 14, 1946, the U.S. delegation announced a plan for a total ban on nuclear weapons, which went down in history as the Baruch Plan. On the surface, the plan seemed to have good goals, but it envisioned international inspections by the UN Commission on Atomic Energy with simultaneous authorization to take coercive measures against violators. Moreover, its decisions would not be subject to the veto power of the permanent members of the UN Security Council. And here Baruch's plans encountered the distrust of Stalin, who realized that their implementation would slow down the USSR's progress toward the creation of its nuclear capabilities, necessary to ensure its own security. The Soviet delegation at the UN conference took advantage of the fact that the American proposals were fundamentally at odds with the UN Charter and its structure and vetoed them. How did it end for Baruch? Nothing. Since 1949, the world began a nuclear arms race, accompanied by the development of tactics and strategies of ideological sabotage, where Bernard Baruch felt like a fish in water. Until his advanced old age, he personally took care of business. By the end of his life, the assets of firms and funds under his control reached $1 trillion. Surprisingly, but the master of destinies did not hide from people, was very easy to communicate, talking in the park with vacationers, finding out what their moods and wishes, and security near him was not seen. Baruch was laid to rest in 1965 in a simple cemetery on the outskirts of New York. Neither fences nor pompous monuments on his grave is not. Only a modest small slab on the lawn. The surprising thing is that today nothing is known about the heirs of Bernard Baruch's trillion-dollar fortune, his grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Someone with an almighty hand deleted all information. There are also no collective photos from Bernard Baruch's funeral, as it was probably attended by his successors who do not want to be seen. Who now manages the colossal assets of the owner of $1 trillion fortune is unknown. So, the Baruch Bank, created 400 years ago, is now modestly nestled in the fourth 10 in the world ratings. Because there is the Bank of Banks, which does not need any ratings, and there are all the others. And it's no coincidence that in the world production of 9 to 11, the International Department of the Standard Chartered Bank's headquarters was located in an additional, supposedly, spontaneously collapsed, building. In a matter of seconds, trillions of dollars worth of records disappeared in the ruins and tens of tons of gold were written off. And then there are the Schiff, Leib, Kuhn families. Do you know anything about these families? Maybe we should make a video where the directors of entire countries and peoples will no longer be them, but where these masters of money will be the protagonists, actors, revealing their inhumanity. Thumbs up if you're intrigued, and set your notifications so you don't miss the premiere. See you soon.